I want to talk about traffic lights for a second. In 1914, the first traffic light as we know it was installed in Cleveland, Ohio's 105th Street. At the time, people were probably pretty confused with what to do with it. It may be common knowledge now that red means stop, green means go, and yellow means floor it, but back in the day, they had no idea. It was only until the late 1910s that they began to amass great appeal in the US government's eyes. Now, of course, people were fine with its implementation. Police didn't have to stand in roads anymore, and there were far fewer accidents. But, as always, there will always be opposition to something the government does, and thus enters what we'll be referring to as the Anti-Light Party, or ALP. Now, before I tell all of you about the ALP's shenanigans, I do need to ask you a simple question. It's been 107 years since that first traffic light, so what do you think about traffic lights? Would you say they're beneficial? Good for society, even? For the most part, the majority of you would say that, yeah, of course they've been. Why wouldn't they be? Well, to answer your question, let's see what the Anti-Light Party has to say.
We, the Anti-Light Party, strongly believe that the very symbol of government tyranny hangs above us upon a steel pole overshadowing our very transportation routes. Our government, though allegedly democratic in nature, has forced its hand upon the citizens of this once fair nation. We shall not stand for such a deliberate mocking of our wits. Instead, we shall rise up and take to the streets of this nation to protest such a horrendous breach of our civil liberties as free-thinking individuals of the United States of America. The street should be free and open for the masses to drive through in order to get to their destination much more quickly and effectively than the government would have us believe due to our barbaric implementation of the light-based system. To see so many come out in support of it could be chalked up to nothing less than governmental mind control. Signed, the Anti-Light Party.
Huh. Now, it's important to note that the ALP was a very, very tiny portion of the US. Most people were fine with the implementation, and even those that were weirded out by it still weren't desperate enough to join the ALP. But, as we all know, over time, the change came to be seen as a good thing, and ultimately beneficial. And hey, those effects were immediate. The death rate due to car accidents almost immediately dropped with the implementation of traffic lights across the US. So why, then, was it that the numbers of the ALP also grew? It's simple. Conspiracy and non-arguments. Now, to the uninformed, a non-argument is a factually wrong argument that's presented as a loose statement rather than an actual argument. An example could range anywhere from, I heard that pizza place down the street has a rat problem, to, those Palestinians are planning to nuke Israel. They're intended to get you to focus on the narrative rather than the evidence behind it, so that hopefully you'll look over the fact that what they just said doesn't have any basis in reality. So, the ALP tried to do that, and to a portion of America, they succeeded. They made wild claims that this was the first step towards government tyranny, and pretty soon America would begin to introduce more and more tyrannical legislation until it began to form its own version of serfdom. And their followers, afraid that America was headed down that road, ate it up. So what did they do? They kept recruiting more and more until they could actually cause some damage. Over a very short period of time, the narrative spread across the country, and people actually believed it, calling those in favor of traffic lights sheeps and fools. They began to grow a cultish following around these lights. Riots were held. Major damage occurred across the roads of the US. Overall, it was a shit show. A non-existent shit show, but still. Yeah, that's right. I made the whole thing up. It is a good story, though. I mean, could you actually imagine the government putting something beneficial into legislation to counter a frequent problem that was getting worse and worse by the day, and then having a bunch of paranoid idiots run out of the woodwork to reverse that progress under the guide of some influential conspiracy theorists that were feeding them harmful and wrong information, thus causing more deaths and injuries over the long term, all the while being completely convinced that they were in the right, despite having irrefutable evidence that the government's policies were actually really helping and what they were doing was harming America as a whole? Because I sure can't.